Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
My guest today is Andrew Yang. I'd never heard of Andrew until he ran for president of the United States in 2020. I don't recall when he first got my attention, but I do recall thinking, wow, he makes a lot of sense and has some interesting new ideas. And he seems genuine and a breath of fresh air. His thinking about automation and its implications resonates with a lot of people, including myself. Much of what humans do will be done better, faster, and cheaper by machines in the future, so we would be wise to prepare for it. Andrew's signature policy during the presidential campaign was Universal Basic Income, or UBI, of $1,000 a month as a response to job displacement by automation. He's been credited with popularizing UBI through his candidacy and activism. In today's conversation, I cover a range of topics, including UBI and automation, but equally importantly, what he stands for and what changes he'd like to make to the American political and social systems. Specifically, is America enmeshed in a dysfunctional duopoly that is stifling the democratic process and preventing change? Is it time to think of a credible third party in the US? Let's hear what Andrew has to say on these things, which he's described in his new book called Forward. Andrew, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you, Vasant. It's great to be here.
So let's start with your latest book, Forward, which I read with great interest. You know, you quote Ezra Klein quite extensively in the book. And there was one quote in particular that caught my eye, where you say, toxic systems compromise good individuals with ease. Now, I view you as a good individual. And by the way, I want to say right up front, I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. And, you know, I am hoping you're going to run again in 2024 and win. But before I go there, I just want you to comment, you know, let's take this forward. And the question I want to ask you is like, what do you really stand for, in the sense that politics is about compromise, and that quote says that, you know, very clearly. What are the kinds of things where there is no compromise? What are the core sort of values you stand for as a politician?
I stand for a new, fresh, data-driven, solutions-oriented approach to politics, free of the vested interests of certain people that have, frankly, been crouching on our government for quite some time, saying, you know, we have to do things a certain way because their financial interests are deeply, deeply tied to maybe doing things a certain way. So a new data-driven, solutions-oriented approach.
So that's really music to my ears. You know, another one of those reasons why I'm a big fan, you know, of applying sort of the scientific method to public policy. And I'm going to come back to this. So let's talk about the 2020 presidential election. What was the biggest challenge you faced going into that election?
You know, Vasant, it's really funny because I had been a serial entrepreneur, and I looked up and said, okay, I'm going to run for president, and I'm going to raise millions of dollars, and I'm going to get this message out and the rest of it. And it turns out that no one cared about me or my presidential campaign when I first declared, which on one level I should have expected. But on another level, I was like, oh, I thought people would be really excited about UBI, about AI and automation and the rest of it. So it was a bit of a struggle. And you read my book, so you got a sense of the early days. I think the biggest surprise was just how little energy there was around the campaign at first. Happily, that changed over time. What did you think of the early chapters of the book when I talked about our start as a campaign?
It really resonated with me. I can see why it was difficult to sort of get that attention, you know, and you talk about that first debate where it was like minute 32 or something before they've turned to you for the first question. So I can totally empathize with that, just getting people's attention. But, you know, I was really encouraged by the way it went subsequently, like the second debate and everything else. I mean, you know, you just had some momentum that you built up, which was impressive, you know, considering what you're talking about, which is just getting attention, getting noticed.
Vasant, I'm going to say something that, so people look at my run and I can sense that some people are intrigued by it and thinking, okay, like how can we do it again? And there are other people that have tried to stake their own campaign or make their own case, which I applaud, I encourage. But having been through this process, I got to say it is wild where if someone says, hey, I'm running for president, the first reaction is actually disdain and skepticism. The first reaction is not like, oh, glad someone's throwing their hat into the ring. So we're going to see this dynamic play out a number of times, I think. And so that was the surprise. You're right that we did get a lot of momentum and make a big case. But if someone believes that they're going to have the same arc that I did, like there's so many things that had to kind of break in our direction. So I'm both encouraged and disheartened by my own experience, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. And by the way, in your book, I got a chuckle reading about the various taunts that were thrown your way in high school as an Asian American. You talk about how it sometimes made you angry, but more resolute to try and change things, or as I like to say, become Gandhian, as in be the change in the world you want to see. And you did get attention and name recognition and momentum that you had going into your New York mayoral race. So what went wrong there?
No, I think a lot of the dynamics in the mayoral race shifted when the city opened back up. Crime became the most pressing issue. And before that point, I'd been kind of the happy warrior. And I think people were attracted to the optimism around reopening the city and maybe my relatability. But the landscape of the race shifted, I think, to public safety. And then it's hard to be, frankly, jovial about it because it's such a serious issue. And I met relatives who lost their loved ones in various contexts. So there was a lot of heaviness. In terms of the race itself, I think a lot of it was in the media. Like there were certain media organizations that seemed to have a very, very negative coverage angle where my campaign was concerned. And a lot of it was because if you were another campaign, your main move was to push negative stories. And so we had a great deal of energy initially that just, I felt a little bit like, I told this joke where it's like I was like a whale, and then every day you'd get like harpoons in the sides or the back in various ways, and just like keep swimming. And I was like, yeah, if I keep swimming, like it'll be all right. but I think eventually the negative coverage took a toll.
Was there anything else other than the negative coverage? Why the media organizations angle against you?
Well, Vasant, I think that this is something that's driving me now. Truly, is that you have this institutionalism around certainly our media, and I think people are sensing that in various ways around our politics. And then if you have someone like Andrew Yang come along, then there's a threatening or disruptive aspect for people who are on the inside. And so there was this native resistance, and I think the media coverage was an outgrowth of that.
I'm going to come back to this point a little bit later in a slightly different context, just about, the way the political system is set up and, what happens if you sort of don't fall into a standard stereotype. Let's go into universal basic income, which you mentioned, right? So frankly, my thinking about that is that was a brilliant positioning on your part because, hey, it's new. It's something that has been talked about not quite as seriously by people like Milton Friedman, Stephen Hawking, and you sort of really took a position, which I thought was brilliant because it positioned you somewhat differently and positioned you as a visionary. And, I was thinking it's brilliant because you can't go wrong, right? If UBI becomes the thing, you're going to be the man, right? You're going to be visionary. And if it's not time yet, well, there's nothing wrong with that either. You've got a conversation started, which is the most interesting conversation. So I thought it was brilliant strategically.
Well, I genuinely believe that some version of universal basic income is inevitable. And to your point, if I could speed up the timeline, that would be an epic accomplishment. So that was my thinking early on. You're right. I was like, oh, best case scenario, we get this done in a big way and hopefully help keep society more whole and functional. And then the downside is that I speed up the timeline. So it's one of the main things that prompted me to run was the feeling that I could have a positive impact in a variety of ways.
So let's get into the basics of UBI. Like, what's the thinking and the math at a high level? I think there are concerns about it being too expensive and how it's going to be funded, plus other concerns about what it does to dignity of labor and the perverse incentives it could create. But let's start with the math. My rough estimate is that the cost of UBI will be close to the GDP of the
Well,
US.
it's certainly going to be the GDP of the country. I think the GDP of the country is something like 22 trillion.
Right. Yep.
So
Yep.
if you did that math, it'd be, I think the UBI would be in the mid tens of thousands of dollars per person, which would be,
Right.
very, very dramatic move. The math is, to me, being laid bare by what the government's doing right now. So the CARES Act cost $2.2 trillion when it was passed a number of months ago. And if you look at the math on that, that's actually enough to give every man, woman, and child in the country $1,000 a month for 6 months. And we passed that. It was a real bill. The problem is that 83% of that money did not go to people or families. It went into pipes. It went into shoring up institutions, banks, airlines, you name it. And then the thought was that, well, that money will dribble down to people in various ways. If you had reversed that and said, look, we're just going to make sure people are okay, and then the capital structures will adjust, that could have worked. And we chose a very, very different path. Now, I'm someone who thinks that right now we're spending the money in a variety of ways. We're just doing it really, really wastefully and poorly. One thing that I think most people would understand is we spent $3 trillion on the military conflict in Afghanistan, and now looking at that, people are like, "Oh, where did we get out of that expenditure?" Right now, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on various disability and unemployment-related programs that have negative incentives attached to them. Where if you're able-bodied or feel better or you get a job, then we snatch the benefits away, which I'm going to suggest is not encouraging the kind of culture or economy that we need. So there are a lot of things that are already out there in the system that make it so that a universal basic income would be a more efficient use of resources than what we're currently seeing. And it would be dramatically less punitive, less paternalistic, more, to your word, dignified. It would actually treat people like adults and decision makers and say, you know best how to improve your own life and solve your own problems, not a government program or a bureaucracy.
So is the idea that we'd scrap all these other assistance programs? I mean, you refer to the fact that more than half of Americans receive some sort of aid from the government. Is the thinking that this would just simplify things? Because it's hard to cut programs, right? That's just a very hard thing to do.
What I was suggesting was an opt-in. It's like, we're not going to get rid of programs, but if you opt into this thing, then it's going to replace certain benefits that you're already getting, with the thought being that everyone has a floor. And this is something that I thought would benefit just about everyone, because if you're getting a certain amount of disability or it's more than this $1,000 a month that I was proposing, then no harm done. You'd still have the same amount coming in, but the people around you 9 times out of 10 would probably be in better shape. So that there are different ways to structure it. In my mind, there's a universal basic income that would make just about everyone pretty happy. And there are different ways it could interact with the system. But the fundamental idea around a foundation or a floor for everyone and making everyone a stakeholder in society and get the boot off of people's throats, I think did win over the support of millions of Americans. Right now, 65% of Americans are for some version of universal basic income, which I joke is way up from the 27% it was when I started. And if it had been 65% when I was running, then who knows? Maybe I would have won.
Yeah, no, fair enough and well put. Is there any way to test whether an idea like this would work?
Well, we have a lot of very, very big trials going on right now. In the child tax credit is one example. Another is the pilots that are going on around the country. There are dozens of cities that are now launching different pilots. And a study just came out that said that the child tax credit, which is being applied to about 70 million Americans around the country, has shown to increase work hours in 25% of cases. So there's some very exciting data coming out in the real world right now at scale, which is something that would have been very hard to imagine when I was running.
That's very cool. It would be nice to have some real data on how it works in reality to guide policy. So, talking about policy to someone who's a tech-savvy politician, what's your thinking about the power and practices of big tech? Do you favor business as usual, or are we behind the curve, in which case we need to make some changes, and soon?
Of course, we should be getting our arms around the excesses of big tech. These firms have reached a scale where they're more akin to governments themselves than they are private companies. They touch billions of people's lives. They, in some ways, control our democracy already. And government leaders have been decades behind the curve, in part because they're really old, but in part because DC is generally on a 20 to 30 year time lag. And in a time of rapid technological change, you can't be 20 to 30 years behind. So the question is, what now? How are we going to try to curb the excesses of Facebook, Google, and some of the other tech companies? I think Facebook really ought to be front and center because they have such a pivotal role in our public life, and not just here, but around the world.
So what should we do? I want to bounce a few ideas off you because I've been writing about this for some time now. And initially, some of the reactions was quite negative.
Well, Vasant, I just want to talk to you about this for a second, is that there are a lot of people, and we've all been conditioned a certain way. There are a lot of people that listen to you that are of the tech world. And so there's an instinctive mistrust of government because you're the government's stupid, it's backward, it's political, these people don't understand, and I get it. I do. I really do. But then you look at the technology companies themselves, and they're all about efficiency, revenue maximization, hand in hand with engagement. And then you have to ask, okay, what is the natural impulse of restraint in the tech company? And it's very, very limited. The restraint impulse is pretty much hey, I hope this doesn't blow up in my face in terms of a PR fiasco. But in this day and age, even if it is a PR fiasco, you just hunker down and wait for the storm to pass because our discourse is so dysfunctional. So people who listen to it, then if you recommend reasonable circumscription of these tech companies, then people will be oh no. But it is the right move. It's necessary. It's long overdue. The tech companies have essentially been allowed to grow uncontrollably, follow their market incentives to the logical extremes, to a point where now even people in those companies are looking up saying, okay, look, we're going a little bit too far here. I have a lot of friends in Silicon Valley. I'm sure you do too. That's the way most of them feel too. They're look, we're not perfect and these problems are getting more and more serious. So the question is, how do you actually try to curb the excesses in a way that doesn't end up going too far? And that's a very reasonable conversation. But just saying that any regulation doesn't make sense, to me, is a very, very extreme point of view at this stage. So pretty much I'm siding with you, Vasant. When you said, hey, you suggested some regs, and then people are oh no, it's I get it. We've been conditioned in a particular way to think that, the tech companies are smart and efficient and the government's dumb and slow. And there's some truth to those generalizations, but we have to recognize where the market incentives have led us.
Are we just looking at the problem through a 1960s lens? For example, people sort of use the Bork doctrine, and if prices go down, then, it's better for consumers. And now we live in an era of zero-priced goods. And so you sort of scratch your head and say, well, it's all free for people, so it must be good. Are we just looking at this problem through an outdated lens?
Oh, yeah, 100%. There's a backwardness to a lot of our regulatory and legislative approaches. Certainly, consumer pricing doesn't make much sense because when you have a tech quasi-monopoly, it can drive the prices down and say, look, no harm done. Meanwhile, they end up squeezing out all sorts of competition effectively. They use their market power in different ways. The thing that I think we should be angry about and animated around is that Facebook has clearly had a negative effect on our mental health. Social media is clearly having a negative effect on our mental health. And I'm a parent. Any parent listening to this is like, okay, you can see your kids getting hypnotized by the screens. It's rewiring the brains of the next generation. Who around us does not think that this is something that we should be concerned about? I suggested something in a recent conversation. Maybe Instagram should not be available to minors between the hours of midnight and 7 a.m. Maybe, like a random thought that's like, that society could agree on. And then can you all imagine Facebook voluntarily saying, you know what, we're just going to say Instagram's not available between midnight and 7 a.m. to minors? They're never going to raise their hand and do that. But I think most parents would look at that and say, it's pretty reasonable. It's like, I don't really like my kid waking up in the middle of the night, looking and swiping at pictures and looking at what their friends are doing. It's like there might be a certain time. And I'm talking about school nights. I mean, who knows? Maybe you can like pivot it a little bit on weekends and whatnot. But there's some stuff that what we should be very animated around. And of course, the political conversation is so nonsensical around it. It's around like politicization of certain viewpoints, which is to me, okay, you can have arguments around that, but that's like, so marginal compared to the collective deterioration of the mental health of our kids and young adults and teenage girls in particular and the rest of it. Like, why are we just standing around saying this is okay? I mean, it's really baffling, but it's just a sign of how far we've fallen, where our government and our media, by the way, are completely, if you were generous, you'd say they're behind the curve. But I think it's worse than that, unfortunately.
Maybe we're standing around saying it's okay because there's no smoking gun. My colleague Jonathan Haidt has drawn attention to this issue, where the timing of increased depression and suicides among young teen girls in particular is highly suggestive and points to Instagram, but there's no smoking gun. And only Facebook has the data that would confirm things like this, and others that we might not even be aware of.
You can just ask any freaking parent and they'll confirm it for you. You know what I mean? This is like a phantom relationship.
Okay, so what should we try and do to make social media less injurious or less risky for society? In other words, what should we do about Section 230, which provides blanket immunity to social media platforms? Should we start, for example, by removing immunity if they amplify content?
I agree with that as the change. It's like, look, if you're going to profit by amplifying a post on your algorithm, then you should be responsible. If someone posts something and you're not distributing it widely or making money off it, it's like, okay. And then maybe even some, but as soon as you start making money off it, we should be able to hold you accountable. I think that's a fine standard.
Right. So then the conversation would then focus on, okay, what does it mean to actually amplify something and where do we draw the line? Is that how you see it?
That's one of the ways I see it, Basan. And in my book, you saw, I recommend we just try and get rid of the advertising model on social media because it ties all of the financial incentives to engagement. And then the company then just dopamine drops and addicts you over time because that's how they make more money. Like some of the companies that have subscription models are much more sane because they know that, look, I just need to keep you happy enough where you don't just unsubscribe. I don't need to addict you. I don't care about, you know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't need to go that crazy. And the founders of Google said that advertising was going to end up, there are different thinkers on this. Jaron Lanier said, look, we were trying to figure out how to make it free. So we went with advertising, but that was the wrong choice. The companies are now selling and reselling our data for $200 billion plus a year. We're all becoming like rats in a maze. And so there's a hidden cost to advertising as a business model that we should confront as a society. What I suggest is that we have an option where people can opt into ad-free versions of social media networks, which, by the way, everyone would just freaking jump for joy about. It would improve incentives and behaviors. And in my recommendation, I was like, the government should essentially just give us all like a social media stipend where it's like you can just cash out to ad-free versions of your two favorite social media networks and then move on from there. So that's one obviously very, very big sweeping change that I would recommend that I think would help us immensely. I love Jonathan Haidt's idea around trying to create a filter where if someone makes aggressive and angry posts routinely, you can like filter them out. Because right now there is no disincentive to being inflammatory. And you don't want to say, look, you can't express your point of view, you can't be inflammatory, but I should be able to opt not to see things from people that are consistently just going to be hostile if that's my choice. So I think that there are big things that we should be doing on these platforms if we're going to have some degree of shared reality, really. So that there's a related issue here is that we're now in these splintered news silos, and we're seeing the effects of it right now in terms of people not being able to agree on any kind of factual reality.
In fact, I was struck when I was reading your book. You talked about how news used to be quote unquote delivered in the 80s. There were three networks, maybe PBS, it was reported it sort of in somber tones. Whereas now news is actually created. So there's this sort of distinction between reporting news and creating it through amplification, etc. And, so if you're going to create news, well, then, you should be liable for what you're creating. That makes complete sense to me.
Well, yeah, there's like a muddying of the water. Certainly, one of the big problems is that cable, quote unquote, news broadcasts have completely lost any distinction between news and opinion. They so much of it's personality driven, and they're competing on 15-minute ratings blocks. So they have to try and gin up emotion. I mean, this stuff applies to the New York Times too. A report came out around how they figured out what content engages you the most. By the way, it tends to be a little bit emotionally manipulative, and it involves topics like race that get you, your juices flowing to a higher degree. So there are market incentives, really. Like that, you can trace a lot of this just to what is in this organization's or journalists' financial interest, and then take it from there.
I couldn't agree more. So you talk about the two-party system, and it's just designed to create polarization, and you argue for the creation of a third party. Say more about that. Are we just mired in this cycle of polarization with our existing political structure?
Oh my gosh, it's getting worse before our eyes, where they're redrawing district lines so that the number of safe seats is going to go up from its already staggering 83% to maybe 90%. So they're going to be 90% of congressional districts where the Democrat or Republican is going to win, as long as they get through their nomination process. So all of the suspense or action will be in the primary, which, by the way, will distort everyone's incentives, because it's like, okay, I don't have to make 51% of you happy. I just need to try and keep the most radical, rabid 10% in my party off my back, and then I get to keep my job forever. There's a 28% satisfaction rate with the U.S. Congress right now, and a 94% reelection rate. So that's a product of this two-party system where they're just carving it up in a way that gives them all long-term job security. It's really, really dark, truly. So we have to try and generate genuine competition for the two parties. But guess what? They have actually locked it up so that you can't meaningfully contest them in the majority of races. So what to do? What do we do? It turns out 62% of people want to move on from the duopoly, but everyone's been brainwashed into thinking, well, it can't be done. As an entrepreneur, if you showed up at a marketplace and there were two providers and 62% of people wanted an alternative, you'd start a provider, a new provider, a third one immediately. So the question is, what can we do in real life that will actually enable us to compete? And the answer is that we have to change the mechanics of these elections to nonpartisan open primaries and ranked choice voting, which would then enable new points of view, new parties to emerge. And it turns out that there's a vulnerability in the system that allows us to do this, where 24 states have ballot initiative provisions where if 51% of people typically get together and say, let's make this change, then it will happen. And just to show that this isn't illusory, one state already did this last year. Alaska shifted from closed party primaries to open primaries and ranked choice voting. And it's already dramatically improved the incentives for the legislators from Alaska because they're not in thrall to the party anymore. They can do what they think 51% of us want. So it's a difficult path out, I'm not going to lie, but you're talking about maybe like $150 to $200 million spent on ballot initiatives in 12 states in 2022 that might win in, let's call it 3, 4, or 5 states. What would you pay to have 6, 8, or 10 U.S. senators who could do what they wanted as opposed to what their rabid partisans want? That could be the difference between democracy living or dying, truly. So that's the task in front of us. If you're listening to this and you're not a fan of the political parties, like if you're listening to this, I'm going to take some guesses about you. You're like a rational, tech-savvy, future-oriented type, and you have a distaste for politics most of the time because you're like, oh, like it's so backwards and tribal and irrational, and I try and avoid it whenever possible. That is a purely sensible decision, and I appreciate that that's what you think. The problem is that if we let this dysfunctional duopoly continue, it's going to end up in Civil War 2.0, truly. I mean, things are getting that bad. And so if you want to try to make this system more sensible and rational, we need to break up the duopoly. And the best way to do that is to enable new parties and points of view to emerge through nonpartisan open primaries, supplemented by ranked choice voting. Sorry to be so long-winded there, Vasant.
Not at all. In fact, I'm actually encouraged to see that where ranked choice voting is being taken seriously. We use it in New York City, so it's something that I think makes a lot of sense. I just view this as such a mountain of a problem to address because of the entrenched interests that I'm just amazed that anyone would take this on. And so I'm impressed. And I think I should have asked you way earlier, like, what made you believe that, we can actually take on this problem and make a change? Just considering how difficult this is.
Well, Vasant, one of the things that happened to me during the presidential campaign is that I became something of a public figure. And there's like a responsibility attendant to that. You know what I mean? Like if I believe something can make a difference, then maybe if I put my shoulders into it, I can actually get other folks to weigh it and say, oh, like that actually might work. And the recommendations I'm making are not mine. They were born of the work of people like Catherine Gale and Michael Porter in terms of open primaries and ranked choice voting, Jonathan Haidt, who you and I both know, Ezra Klein, Lawrence Lessig. There are different thinkers who've been staring at these problems and identifying a path out. And I see my role in American life as trying to mainstream someone else's great ideas. Like universal basic income, not my idea. Like this democracy reform agenda, other people's great ideas. But I think I can help. And so that's my role, and there aren't that many people who unfortunately can help at this point in American life. It's kind of a tough era that way. Virtually all of the political figures have been co-opted by, the current incentives and the duopoly and the rest of it. So yeah, I have something of an obligation. I'm going to do my best to live up to it. I hope other people will consider joining me in this. Go to forwardparty.com, check it out. Let's fight for the future. I mean, we know we can do better than this. We know we can. And I'm going to suggest that not only can we do better than this, but we have to do better than this if our kids are going to grow up in a place we're excited about at all.
I'm glad to hear that, and I find it motivating. And talking about Washington being decades behind the curve, I'm also struck by the fact that the world our kids and grandkids will inhabit will be so different from the ones that our lawmakers are grappling to understand. There's the emerging world of crypto and smart contracts, where machines will be doing lots of things that lawyers and other intermediaries currently do. It's going to change the way many people conduct their lives and interact with government. Things like DAOs, for example, are going to do away with certain kinds of institutions. And then there's this emerging metaverse, which completely boggles my mind. But we need lawmakers to wrap their heads around this emerging brave new world, and the sooner, the better.
Yes. A lot of the folks who are involved in the cryptocurrency community, I mean, I'm going to do my best to be helping on that side, trying to, again, be an interface for a sensible interaction with the government. But with DAOs and these other implementations or applications of the blockchain, I mean, you can imagine very, very dynamic democracy of the future. My hope is that eventually we can vote on our smartphones, and then you can see very, very different distributions of power and influence and popular will. So you're right. You can see what could be possible, and then you have our government kind of limping along, bringing up the rear. If we can try and speed it up, it would be an amazing contribution.
Yeah, there's a whole new world of people growing up who are quote unquote crypto natives, who are more comfortable without intermediaries of any sort, including lawyers. Makes me wonder whether we'll need a lot fewer lawyers in the world that's run by code. So talking about code and a world run by robots, there are two major questions it raises. One having to do with what humans will do, and maybe UBI is the way for us to pay society a quote-unquote productivity dividend they create. And this gets back to how we fund UBI. Should we tax robots to fund that dividend?
We should tax robots. That's like the short answer. We should not be taxing human labor as much as we do. Because you tax things you don't want to encourage more of, and we should be trying to encourage labor and labor type arrangements in every context. The example I try and use, Vasant, is that Google has AI that will be able to do the work of call center workers pretty quickly, maybe yesterday. And there are 2 million Americans who do that job right now, who, by the way, generally pay taxes. So how much will Google pay on its AI in terms of taxes? And the answer is right now, not a whole heck of a lot. So if you keep on trying to follow around human labor, you're going to find less of it to tax over time. And everyone's going to look around saying, where'd all the money go? So you have to try and speed up and tax robots and AI as they supplant a lot of workers.
This is an interesting sort of challenge, and Hawking talked about this as well. It's a challenge of distributing the benefits of the abundance of machine-produced wealth. But how would it actually work? Because the proposals I've seen seem to be in the spirit of, well, if you replace a human with a robot, you've got to pay taxes. And that almost sort of seems to defeat the purpose.
Like that imagines that you can identify it like that cleanly and easily a lot of the times.
Right.
I mean, if you've been in a company, I mean, all sorts of shifts are happening, and you can do something in one department that affects some other department, and you're like, who the heck knows if it's not a one-for-one replacement. I tried to explain this to people where it's not like at the mall, all of a sudden there's like a robot shop clerk. It's just the mall
exactly.
like the mall closed because the robot's at Amazon, a few towns away.
Right. So how would it actually work? Right. How would you tax machines?
Oh, so I was recommending a value-added tax, which then ends up capturing it in a way that you can't game your way out of. So that's one approach. Another approach is you could target, at this point, because the tech world is so concentrated, you could try and, frankly, like sit down with individual firms and figure out, an arrangement that has their tax burden go up from its current, in some cases near zero level.
Level of zero, yes.
Yeah. So there are different mechanics, but it's tough. The one reason I love the VAT is that these firms already pay a VAT in other countries. So like they can do it at the drop of a hat. We're the only developed country that doesn't use a VAT. Like that's one elegant way to get the AI and robots revenue in, without having to go around and having, someone say like, this was a robot, this was not.
And so the value added, I recall reading that in your book. So say more about that. Like walk through an example, like how would we figure out what value added tax for Google's search engine would be?
Well, the value added tax just ends up attaching it to most every transaction. And so the cost gets passed through the system in a way that, again, is inescapable. So if you have Google, there's a transaction, but there's going to be a value-added tax paid. And then, the take that Google's participating in right now would end up being reflected in the tax that Google pays as part of that process. Amazon, too, the same thing. It's in many ways, it's like oxygen a little bit. And my belief is that a lot of the economic activity at this point is touching these platforms in a way that would generate, hundreds of billions of dollars pretty quickly.
I think I get the gist of the approach where you're calculating this sort of at the transaction level.
Yeah,
is that right?
that's right. And there
Okay.
are other things too that the EU is doing where they're trying to tax digital economies specifically, which is something that I know some people listening to this will be like, ugh, it sounds awful. But I think that that's something that we should be exploring too.
Personally, is your view that most humans will get displaced from jobs? Because when I talk to, let's say, like Eric Brynjolfsson would say, that technology usually leads to sort of complementary investments in processes and people, and so for the foreseeable future, there really isn't a real problem. That there's no dearth of employment. That things people do will sort of change slightly, and that this is a problem we shouldn't be worrying about. What's your thinking on this?
I talked to Eric about this, and Eric is pretty much on board. I mean, heck, his book, The Second Machine Age, was one of the books that influenced me about, frankly, that we're going to automate a lot of work. The thing I try and look at, Vasant, is that our labor force participation rate has been dropping for years and is right now anomalously low among industrialized countries. You can argue about why that is, but that would be where I'd start. Is you look up and say, okay, why is our participation rate so low? It's comparable to like the Ukraine or El Salvador, and then take it from there and try and figure out how you can re-engage people in work. And one of the things I find frustrating about this is like, look, there is like data where if you look up and say, how's the US doing? And you would say, objectively, we're doing quite poorly. Now, you can attribute that poor performance to different causes, but the case is very, very clear that people dropping out of the workforce for a variety of reasons is driving social, cultural ills, political ills, like a lot of problems, really. And I think technology is going to make that significantly worse. I don't see how it could not. I'll give you the most basic example of them all. Is that you and I are having this conversation remotely. A lot of people who are listening to this are working remotely. If you're not commuting into the office, there are a lot of shopkeepers and diners and restaurants and servers and the rest of it that are still waiting for you to come back, and you're not coming back, and so they're going to shut down. Like there are all of these effects of technology that are evident to all of us, and most people still do pretty simple jobs. Like that's one thing too, that people listening to this are probably educated and tech savvy and the rest of it. A lot of people still do one of like the most common jobs in our society around food service and food prep, customer service, manufacturing, truck driving, and transportation. Like those are the most common jobs in the economy still.
No, absolutely. In fact, you and I are New Yorkers, and if you go to Midtown, it sort of still feels like a ghost town.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. Good thing I'm not the mayor. I'm just kidding.
So there's a couple of things I want to touch on before we wrap up. One of the chapters in your book struck me. It's called Return to Facts. You've talked about the fact that we're just not measuring the right things. And a typical example is GDP. It doesn't measure a lot of things we care for in our society, like mental health, well-being, etc. None of that shows up in GDP. So what are the things that we should be measuring? What are the things that government should be measuring? And what I want to sort of get to is sort of where's the common ground here, between Republicans, Democrats, regardless of your affiliation. What are the kinds of things that, Americans should know about that pertains to how society is working, other than this GDP number, which sort of measures one little
thing. Or stock
thing.
Market performance. You go on CNBC and you're like, hey, market's good. Right. There's been a real failure on the part of our news media in particular. I mean, as we're having this conversation, the United States is 28th in the world on basic measurements like clean air and clean water, infant mortality, life expectancy, public education. And so we're looking around and our quality of life is sinking, and everyone just keeps pretending that things are fine. And then, by the way, you get Trump, you get Bernie, you get all these people because like people sense that it's not working. So we have to come clean. We have to report to people and say, hey, guess what? 100,000 people died of drug overdoses, in the last 12 months. And it's a sick society. We're a very, very sick society. Our government has been failing us right and left. And let's put the numbers up. And so if you say 28th in the world, I mean, so many Americans are used to being like, we're number one in the world. It's like, you're actually 28th on the things that would matter to you, like how healthy you are, whether your kid's going to live a better life than you will, like the basics. And so I would have those numbers up front and center and just go to Republicans and Democrats and say, okay, how do you plan on improving this? And then we can do whatever you want to do. And then as long as we're held accountable, you can come back at the end and say, like, let's agree on these facts and let's agree on how we're doing. That's what the Forward Party is all about. It's just setting up a baseline of facts and then trying to hold our government accountable for how those measurements perform, the right measurements around mental health and, like the type of environment we'll pass on to our kids and things like that.
Yeah, I made a note of them and I'm actually going to read them out because I think it's worth just knowing what they are, right? And these are Democrats, Republicans, right? So life expectancy, average income, childhood success rates, mental health, freedom from substance abuse, environment, infrastructure, mobility, incarceration, arts, civic engagement. And conservatives would like things like rates of entrepreneurship, labor force participation, efficiency of public resources, military readiness, crime rates, marriage rates, number of children in single-family households, volunteerism, philanthropy. Sound familiar?
They do indeed. Yeah. So different parties can emphasize different goals, but as long as we're trying to move in a direction. And I like a lot of both of those lists,
Yeah, no, I do too. Yeah, I do too. They make a lot of sense. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Not at all. Not at all. I was just scarfing some food because I knew my list was long.
Good one. Andrew, before we wrap up, what's your advice to young people? We've talked about automation, how a lot of jobs are going to get automated, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe it's a little late for retraining, for repositioning for the emerging world. What's your advice to young people these days?
For young people, you're going to be fine if you're listening to this because you're probably educated and into the future. The single best advice I can give to a young person is to try and find something that you're excited about because you'll just be better at it. You'll be more positive about it. And if you can find someone whose career and life looks like what you want for yourself, try and support that person because whatever they do will rub off on you. And you end up being a combination of the people that you've worked with over time. So try and find someone or something. And don't worry too much about what the conventional wisdom is. The fact is, a lot of the jobs of the future are going to be very interpersonal. There's going to be a real premium placed on folks who have soft skills. So even if you're not someone who's, let's say like an engineer or coder, there are going to be ample opportunities as long as you find an environment where you can learn and develop and be excited about the work you're doing.
And what would be your advice to educators and universities, high schools?
I'd want us to push our kids to be okay with some degree of experimentation and failure. Because I think that's the kind of thing that they're going to need out there in the real world.
Well said. Before we wrap up, if you run again for president in 2024, are you likely to run as a candidate of the Forward Party?
We're going to do whatever we think is going to be best for the country, Vasant. I really appreciate this line of inquiry. I want to try and make some progress in 2022. But there is going to be a lot of energy around 2024. I think there is going to be a tremendous appetite for a third-party alternative. And I believe I may very well be part of providing that alternative. So stay tuned.
Well, Andrew, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your time. I'm a huge fan, and I wish you much success going forward.
You too, Vasant. Going forward, indeed. Let's do it. Let's save the country and thus the world for our kids. Appreciate you, Vasant. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew.